Thank you for inviting us here, and thank you for giving us this beautiful weather. We've been here since Wednesday, and someone told us that the sun is always shining in Glasgow, and it obviously is. Beautiful weather. I'm Katarina, and this is Torgny. You see the name spelled here. We're from Lund University, obviously, as Frank said, and that is a research-intensive university. We both work there as academic developers, corresponding to the people in your teaching and learning center here. And we're firmly convinced that no development of teaching and learning will take place unless you, the teachers, do it. It's not us that do it, it's the teachers. You provide, as Anton said, the intellectual capital for the students. Technology is useless without you, he also said. You meet the students, you respond to them, you design their learning experiences. So you are the ones who are pivotal to any development of teaching and learning. And our interest that we will introduce to you today is about how teachers are influenced by networks, social networks we call it. It's not necessarily on the Facebook or sort of using technology. It might also be, as Frank mentioned, in the corridors, over coffee, the informal conversations that you have with colleagues and which actually seem to shape how we think about teaching and how we go about teaching. So that is what we'll introduce to you today. Just a little glimpse of Lund University. As I said, it's very research intensive. It's among the top 100 universities of the world. We have 8 faculties, so it's very comprehensive. Roughly 50,000 students and roughly 6,000 staff. So that gives you sort of an image of the university that we come from.
Okay. So just as a glimpse, you can talk a lot about why you try to develop and how you develop teaching and how you do it on a systematic level. So what this slide wants to illustrate is the fact that we believe that you have to do that firmly embedded in the academic culture that is in place in wherever you do this. It means that it can be done slightly different depending on the basic values of the institution. But since we're coming from a research-intensive institution and we very much understand that Glasgow University is the same, so similar in that way. There are basically 2 things that are most important for academics, and now I'm talking really sort of abstract things. And one is the belonging to a discipline, and that belonging is often very more important than the belonging to the institution. So you have your disciplinary networks. The other one is academic freedom. And academic freedom is an interesting thing so far as it's often talked about when it's threatened. So it's hard to really grasp automatically the whole range of academic freedom, but there are lots of things written about freedom and liberty. I'm thinking now about an essay by Isaiah Berlin talking about positive freedom and negative freedom and how these two are sorry for English stop somewhere, I'm trying to say incompatible. Well, they doesn't go together. Does that work? All right, so it's 2 things that you have to handle. They seem to be contradictory. And it's illustrated in this research as well from Australia that what they did here was to send out a questionnaire to some 1,400 academics in social science in Australia. And they found that academic freedom was understood along these lines that it means being autonomous, you know, I can do what I want, but it also means a loyalty towards something. The discipline towards your institution, your colleagues, to society, and academic freedom seems to be placed on this continuum somewhere. It's usually talked about when it's on the right-hand corner and we feel threatened, but usually in our everyday life we pay loyalty to things. Take the peer review system, for instance, that most of us live with and find to be okay, but it's also limiting freedom in a way. So they give you an idea of the complexity of academic freedom. So this is just a way to illustrate that where we come from, we believe that whatever you do in an institution developing these things, it has to be firmly anchored in the basic values of that institution. All right? Oh, yeah, I forgot that. Was that what I said? Yeah, more or less. I think that's good.
Yeah. So just to give you a flavor of the kind of research that we've done and the strategy that we use in our institution, we want you to think for a few seconds about this. How many do you talk to about teaching in order to get inspiration or deal with teaching challenges? Okay, we'll do a quick survey here. So how many of you can come to think about more than 20 people that you have these kinds of conversations with? Hands up. More than 20. Okay, good. Between 10 and 20? Yeah, fair amount of people. Less than 10? Oh. Thank you very much. You just confirmed our research results. Thank you very much. Very good. You validated it for us. Is there anyone who has 0? No one to talk to?
They wouldn't be here.
Wouldn't admit it. If you had, you now have 200 people in this room, so take the opportunity. And actually, this also confirms what we found in our research. There's no one in our material that has no one to talk to, which might sort of destroy a myth around teaching and learning. We're using this to describe in an article in Studies in Higher Education what we call the significance of the backstage arena. And we call these people that we connect to, that we have conversations with, the significant network of a university teacher. And we also have our own significant networks. It might not necessarily mean that all of these people together form a network so that all of them know each other and are significant to each other. So it's me in the middle and I have different people who are significant to me. But they provide me with trustful conversations about issues that are important to me. And I allow those people to inform and influence the way I think and go about teaching. So that's the significant network, and we'll talk you through a little bit more of that research. What we did was a survey, a little bit more sort of rigorous than the one we just did here. And people responded with a number of conversational partners, as well as whether they found their local teaching culture supportive of this kind of conversations or not. So if you look here at the top, you can see that if people experience their local culture as supportive, they have basically twice as many conversational partners within their discipline, within their local culture, as if they experience this as non-supportive. So you can see that at the top row, more of them experience supportive cultures. You can see 231 total number of conversational partners, whereas 56 if you're in a non-supportive culture. You have more conversational partners per respondent if you're in a supportive culture than if you're not. So this gives us some indications that what we need to do within an institution is to try and form a culture that really supports these kinds of conversations between teachers and people who are engaged in teaching and learning, so that not keeping teaching issues to ourselves and keeping it as a very private business for each teacher, him or herself. So that's the basis of our strategy that we've been using. And Torgny is going to show you an illustration of this.
First, we can say that the study we did has been replicated here in Glasgow, actually, not at this university, but at the university. Is it the University of Caledonia or the Caledonian University? I'm not really sure. So there is a PhD student there doing similar research and confirming the numbers that we got up to. So it seems to be at least something to further explore here. What it also shows is that the development of teaching then should be anchored in the cultural perspectives, in the everyday interactions of teachers. That's where you find your significant networks, and those are the people that you negotiate your beliefs with, and you're solving problems, you decide whether things are important or not. You might take a drastic example, and we now listen to two officials here talking about mentioning MOOCs. And my take on that would be, they talk about MOOCs, and then you will decide in your respective networks whether MOOCs are interesting or not. And extremely hard for these seniors to actually influence these networks. So that's a pre-understanding of how academics form their understanding and beliefs about teaching and learning. So what you hear your officials saying is it might be an input to these conversations, but they are definitely not the result, naturally, of these conversations. That's how it goes on. So this is a graphic illustration of the complexity of this. So if we pick one teacher, we deliberately put teachers as stars here. We thought that was nice to do. So we pick one, and then we put in, hypothetically, a significant network for that person. So here we have 4 relationships that are important for that person. I did believe then by us that if there's something released in the organization or something happens, that person will turn to his or her significant others and talk about it and find out whether that is important or not. The interesting thing is the complexity that emerges if we take 2 more of them and we put in their significant relations. And you see that what goes on here is that we get a very high number of negotiations. And if you want to then project or understand the institution, the number of teachers, the culture of teaching in an institution, you probably have to deal with this network that emerges and try to find out how do we do it to sort of influence that or build on those things that are extremely strong and positive in these networks. Because the stability it creates, it's not just, it shouldn't be viewed as a conservative force only, it also secures a high quality where there is a high quality. And that high quality can maintain its existence even though there are bad things happening around. So you shouldn't necessarily view these networks as something good or bad, more that something is. It is there. The problem here then are several. So if you put in the organizational context, we see in our material that these significant networks go beyond the organizational boundaries. I now have one lecturer in computer science in my head. He's working in our institution. He's an excellent teacher. He talks about teaching with 2 colleagues at the MIT only. All right? So when we say something to him, he would probably turn to MIT and see whether that is a good idea or not. And that makes the management of these institutions rather difficult. Or the stability of the culture is rather good compared to how managers easily can destroy that quality if they are bad managers. So you see how it works at both ends here. And if we put in others here, you get a high complexity of these networks. So what we try to do to understand them in a bigger view is to turn to network theory. This is a terribly simplified version of what comes out from network research. So I really say that it is terribly simplified. But
here the stars turn into very happy faces.
We usually get comments here and say that's something wrong with this. They shouldn't be happy. But we don't really think that's true. So they're happy faces.
Lots of happy faces here.
What's important here now is that people cluster up. In the previous image, there were a huge complexity of negotiations and relationships going on, but basically if you go even further from a cultural entity or group of people, you see they cluster up. And some people talk more intensely with each other than with the others, all right? So what they do in these clusters is that they formulate an understanding of the reality, and that is connected to identity and the belief of who I am and who I am in this world and everything. So they go deep down in your spine, these things. And how often do you actually change spine? Not very often, I believe. So these are stable things. If you can give me another click there. So what these clusters then do is not everybody in these clusters communicate with the outer world just as much as the other ones. They appoint someone. Someone is put forward or emerges in the cluster as the person checking out what's going on in the organization so that the other ones can concentrate on do what they all believe is the most important thing to do. And these people then will hand the information into the others depending on what these clusters believe in. All right? So when they look around what's going on, they are searching for things they believe is important for that very cluster. So one strategy here could be to change the whole system, is to pick out these foreign ministers, put them in a course and make them to believe in something different thing, and then go back to the clusters and tell the others, you know, we were wrong. That will not happen. Because if that happens too drastically, the other ones will just spit out the foreign minister and replace him or her with someone else. So it's extremely hard to change the cluster with that strategy. It doesn't mean that the whole idea is bad, it's just the expectations of the outcome of that strategy might be sort of, you have to adjust them a little bit. Because it could be dangerous for these red people to come back and tell the other ones that we were wrong. Can we get another one? This is a nice one. Can you take it away again? Thank you, Microsoft, for making this so easy. It's not often you thank Microsoft, but once in a while I think they deserve some kind of appreciation. So
that's technology, Torgny.
Yeah, I know. It's a good thing to have. The problem here is that easily the whole culture becomes partitioned. So clusters work independently from each other and they don't talk to each other. And I bet that any dean or rector in the academic world, wheresoever, have this idea, how can I get these people to talk to each other? Because they have to sort of fertilize each other's thinking and things might happen on a bigger scale. Because if they are partitioned, they are also vulnerable for external attacks and pressure because they cannot coordinate their own beliefs and secure their own basic values. You can just eat them piecemeal. As a Pac-Man stuff, that was the old computer game. So they're vulnerable for it, and that is usually a problem for academic cultures, is that we have strong beliefs, but we can't coordinate them. And that makes us vulnerable for external pressure. Administrative sort of routines running through the systems, quality assurance policies and things that just come and go and have some impact but has no impact at the same time, and we have to deal with them. It might be much better if we could actually coordinate this. So being partitioned is a weak point. Anyway, so how do we develop a thing like this? Well, we can turn to research cultures and see what they do there. And we can get the green arrows again. So what they do in a research culture is to get the yellow faces to talk to other yellow faces directly without running past the red faces, going to red faces to a yellow face. They find the significant other directly where that is most important. And actually, if you think about it, what we do in the research culture is that we place a demand on the researcher to first orient himself or herself about what are the others doing, and then you're allowed to do research. While in teaching, we are still in an older version where if you do anything in teaching, you have to tell the other ones. You might see the difference between these two situations, because if you put a demand on the individual to check what the other ones are doing first, it means that you get much more green arrows. So it's just an example of how the teaching culture is actually lacking behind the research culture in this respect. So what we need are artifacts. Sorry, I'm using too much time. That's your face, isn't it? Yeah, all right. So what we need here in this conference are short papers telling the most important stuff about what you have found in your whatever you have now talking and presenting about, so that we can move these papers around. That's why proceedings in these conferences are so important. We need newsletters and easy ways to tell each other about things, so that if I want to find a colleague in this university have tried peer review or among students, I could just check in the database. You know, peer review of students in this university, and comes out 4 of them have done this, and they are short papers. I read them through in 15 minutes, and I decide to call one of them. That's how you increase these green arrows. And you meet other yellow faces instead of talking to the red face, and so, because that's a Chinese whisper game, and things will change when you do that. So anyway, that was a brief of the strategy. So yeah, we went into research on one of these clusters because we thought that was interesting. So what we did was to choose very strong cultures, very strong clusters and microcultures, we now call them. How do they function? And we found these aspects to be important for them. They all had, we looked into 5 of them. If you want to know how we find them, what the methodology was and everything, you have to talk about with us after this presentation. I can't include this. So the aspects were, they all had an enterprise. They had a terribly long time vision, a far-reaching objective. Every time I say far-reaching, I remember when I in Belfast did this presentation, I said wrong. I say far-reaching, and yeah, that was the kind of reaction. So now they were very far-reaching in their visions, you know. In one of these units, there were 11 academics. They told us, we are going to change the society. That's where the objective. It's very different from the management objectives that should be reported and changed in 3 months' time. That is not happening in an academic culture. You work in sort of a very long-term perspectives. There in sports psychology, there are words for that. You know, that's the kind of objective you put up, and you will probably never reach them, but you gravitate towards them all the time. There was a saga, because this development presents stories about what has taken place. And we tell each other, do you remember this and this person? We have a hero here, you know, he or she did establish these units, and this happened. That was a crucial moment that we were almost wiped out, but we managed to say, these are important stories that we tell as a saga, establishing our own identity. It's like Icelandic sagas, this. That's why it's called saga, from Clark, we found it there. And these sagas are told over and over again, and being very important, obviously, for academics. It's the tradition they are talking about. And the tradition seems to be the thing that actually establishes lots of what's true or false in the beliefs of these units. It's intense communication going on inside, and also, and this is important, in these good places, these arrows indicate that they were extremely well oriented about what goes on in the organization. If there was an important policy formed, they knew about it before that policy group was formed, and they were make sure they were in that policy. If they find that policy group to be totally uninteresting, they decided we don't care about that. So they were extremely aware of what's going on, no isolation whatsoever. They really placed themselves in important situations where they knew everything of what's going on around them, which we find interesting. It's a way of counteracting the isolation of the clusters. It's counteracting the process which partitioned the whole organization.
It's also, I think, Torgny, worth mentioning that it's not only positioning themselves in the organization, but also collaborating with other disciplines in other institutions across the world. So having an inflow of new collaborations, new ideas, new ways of doing things, and welcoming that kind of things. However, they did not like if somebody else was sort of pushing them into those kinds of collaborations. For instance, within a big department, the head of department had said to one of these groups, now we want you to collaborate with the other groups in this department and build a joint program. And this particular group were saying, no, that's not for us to engage with. We have other collaborations that we want to sort of prioritize. So they're very actively deciding what kind of collaborations they want to engage with. Yeah. You should say something about this as well.
Yeah, there are lots of stuff written about in cultures about the ethos of a culture. The ethos seems to be the backbone of the culture, and they are embedded in deep values in any cultural grouping that takes place. So you might study culture by going into somewhere and you listen to what people say and you observe what they are doing. That would take you into the artifacts of the culture, the construction of the culture. If you start to ask them, why are you doing this? They will explain to you, we do it because, and those are the espoused ideas of the culture. It takes you a little bit inside the culture. But in the most central part of any culture are something called the basic values or the ethos of the culture. And those things we rarely talk about. Many of us would have problems to tell anyone about what they are. But those are what ethnographers are doing when they enter into a culture. They are looking for this very ethos of the culture because it seems to be, as I said, the backbone of the culture. And it's very important to understand that if you want to understand these places. And the saga and the enterprise seems to be the stabilizing force that help these people to orient themselves in the organizational context where they actually were. And they also decided for themselves whether things were important or not by referring to the enterprise and the saga when they did this. So we just find that to be terribly important when it comes to understanding why the stability in higher education is such a sort of a clear feature that comes back to you when you start to think about change going on. Change seems to be incremental. It's a slow process, but we would argue that it goes on all the time. Universities and higher education are not stable entities really in an absolute meaning, but the differences from year to year might be very small, but they're always happening things. So this is a way of trying to understand more about that.
We've also presented this study in quite a lot of places, and a lot of people start thinking about their own local teaching culture in relation to this model. So it might be helpful to sort of analyze the context that you're in yourselves. We're just going to show you some of the sort of general results of this study. One of the things that struck us really, really early on in this study was the level of trust between the members within these microcultures. They were really, really trusting each other in doing a good job, sort of sharing teaching ideas, even sitting in on each other's lectures and teaching, co-teaching sometimes. There was a high level of trust between teachers and students, and between teachers and their local leaders. So that was really, really striking early on in this study. And as Torgny said, they orient themselves towards this long-term idea of what they want to achieve, what we call the enterprise, whether that was changing society, changing a profession, or something the like. And the saga was really, really strong. And usually people mentioned on the issue of how have you become such a culture the way you are? And people were mentioning people who were there from the start. So it was this professor in 1968 who started sort of everything that is still in the walls, and we're just sort of keeping it to this memory. And by the way, that's him. He's walking over there. So they're sort of very, very particular about a starting point, a person who has been very important in the past. If we look at teaching, and the results generated from these 5 cultures, one of the striking early findings when we tried to identify the 5 groups that we wanted to look at, we went around and interviewed deans and vice deans and chairs of teaching committees and etc. And they had actually a very hard time in identifying good groups, the ones that we wanted to look at. So when asked, where in your faculty could we find excellent teaching and learning environments, they look like, I don't know. And then they said, usually, if you'd asked me where there was a problem, I could have told you within 10 seconds. But I don't really know where the good ones are. Perhaps you should try over there. They have a Teaching Excellence Award winner, so try over there. Or try over there, they keep their budgets, they must be good. Or try over there, they have lots of research grants. So they had all these different strategies and not really very well underpinned. And our conclusion is that there is no sort of shared value system for how to identify the good teaching and learning cultures and environments. And we've presented this to our senior management and to other senior management in universities, and they really take this in as a serious thing that they should try and work with. Anyway, looking at the teaching, generally within these 5 groups, there was a very, very strong engagement for students and their learning. So none of the people that we talked to would say anything like, oh, students here are lazy, students here know nothing about history that they used to do, or they're bad at maths when they come here. But they're really, really serious about learning activities and taking care of their students. And students that we interviewed confirmed this. Students are challenged, so they tell us it's hard to study here. It's really challenging. They have high requirements. It's a high sort of working load, so they require a lot from me being a student here. But they also support me. They support us. They say hello when we meet them in the corridors. They know our names. If we have sort of things we want to address in teaching, we know who to go to, and they really take it seriously if we want to evaluate something that we're not satisfied with.
It doesn't mean that the teachers are actually doing what the students want. What it's about is that they get a fair and sincere response by these units. You know, they are taken seriously. They are not customers demanding things. Teachers are listening to them and then explaining, talking, discussing with these students.
Absolutely. And then the third point here is kind of crucial to us, because we don't really believe that there's any teaching method that is the one size fits all. This is the best teaching method, because that can vary absolutely a lot. And we found that here. So some of these microcultures have quite traditional, you might say, teaching. It's lecture-based, seminar-based, or laboratory work and things that might be considered quite traditional, but they do it with a very high quality and excellently. So the forms of the teaching, the methods that they use, can vary quite a lot. Another important thing is that teaching and research is seen as very, very integrated parts here. We interviewed one lecturer who's a very internationally well-known researcher, and we asked him, how much time or effort do you put into teaching or research? And he said, well, I don't know. They're sort of integrated like this. I couldn't tell you how much time I spend on research or on teaching, because it's integrated like this. And another environment who are really world-leading in their research, they said, well, our research doesn't really matter. Who reads our articles anyway? And they're really world-leading in this field. But the important thing is what the student learn from us, because the students will bring our research and our knowledge into the world, into the society, into different communities, and that's where it will matter. And we find that a fascinating sort of approach to this. And yes, in every 5 group here, personal mastery in teaching is certainly sort of taken for granted and required. So one of the groups here had lots of trouble with a colleague where student evaluations were quite bad. This teacher was not really doing a good job, and they really tried to coach this person. So can we teach together, or do you want my teaching material, and should we sit down and talk about how to solve this? And when we asked, why don't you sort of try to get rid of that colleague then? Would that be possible? And they said, no, he's necessary for our group and he has knowledge that we really need, but we need to coach him to become a better teacher. So it's sort of a collegial responsibility, the quality of teaching. And since we're also interested in leadership, we've been looking from this study.
Yeah, so what we see come out here is that leadership is very important. It's a strong leadership in the sense that people know what to do. It's not anything that people sort of randomly decide for themselves, what do I do next? These are places with a normative structure that actually guide what is going on here. And what we find is that that kind of strong leadership doesn't necessarily mean that you have a strong leader. It's more that people experience a guidance by this normative structure so that they know what to focus upon. And what they describe is that this guidance then releases lots of energy to do what actually matters, you know, doing the research and doing the teaching, because that's where value is constructed. It's not constructed through endless meeting where you try to understand what the others are doing and what we should do. So this strong leadership works not as one person pointing, it's more a collegially constructed normative structure that actually shows you what to do. In that sense, it's extremely strong. We see that leaders are active. As you said, when there is a problem with teaching, for instance, they act immediately and for great length, trying different things in order to get these things in order again, and that is accepted by the others. It's positive to be a leader. We talked to the leaders and they were all sort of, yeah, you know, I'm honored by the other ones who want me to represent us in other contexts. So being this kind of leader or representative person is something that is viewed as very positive. The leadership also, as we have tried to stress here all the time, it looks far ahead all the time. It's not something you do ad hoc. You put out fires or anything like that. It's they know what's going on a long-term basis like this. It is both connected to one person and to several people. One example was that everybody we asked, who is the leader here? It's her. They pointed towards one senior lecturer that was sort of the leader of teaching. But it was in another place, and this was about 60 academics in this place. They were seniors meeting every Monday morning around the table, and all people in that place knew that that's where the important decisions are made. But to secure the legitimacy of these decisions, in this place, they drank coffee twice a day, all together, all 60 together. And that was totally automatic. It's something you had to do. And you can consider going into any department and saying that we are now going to have coffee half an hour every morning and half an hour every afternoon. And most people would probably be crazy. And many would be crazy, you know, I'm working, I don't want to do that. But in this place, it was part of the culture. That's just something you do. And you talk about work during that coffee break. It's a very Swedish thing too. We have a concept we can teach you here. It's called fika. And fika means you have coffee together and talk about important things in a fairly unstructured way. So you come up with new things.
We do that all the time.
Yeah. Yeah. So fika is an important thing in this place, you know. So they secure the decisions of that group by having this fika and having lots of information going back and forth in the organization, so people knew what was going on. But they also resulted in giving away a lot of trust to that kind of group. So that's interesting. Hierarchical, it's interesting because they were all very hierarchical, these places. So the hierarchical structure of these strong microcultures put a new interest into academic freedom again. What does it mean to be a free academic in this kind of collegial context? So academic freedom seems to be a concept that could actually be worth paying attention to and try to open up a little bit what it actually means. Because it comes out here as being part of a normative structure in a hierarchy, and even so, I feel quite free to do what I want. So how that goes together would be an interesting research field in the future, which we haven't done yet. Someone might, somewhere? Yep.
Yeah. We're going to give you one quite concrete example of the use of this strategy that involved teachers within a bachelor program and which involved leadership, very active leadership. They used the concept of critical friends. I'm not sure if you're familiar with that, but the combination of being critical and friendly as a colleague is a quite constructive way of working together deliberately. So looking into one's own teaching, not necessarily in the teaching sessions, but also about teaching. So what was initiated here, it's the bachelor program in physiotherapy in our institution. And what the leader wanted here was a development of the program as a whole. So the different units and in their relation to each other. And this was in partly because of the Bologna process. And she wanted to use this as a vehicle for change. So what she did was to start off with one day off campus for all these 30 different teachers that represented different subject areas within the program. So they went off to a nice place, they had lots of fika, they have nice lunch, it was nice surroundings, and academics are not really spoilt with that in Sweden, so they go to their office usually. So they really appreciated this. And what they discussed there on that one day off campus was, where in the world do we know of the best physiotherapy education? And what do they do that we don't do? What can we learn from them? What do we know about that? What would we want to do if we can dream and try and design the best physiotherapy program for us? So they discussed all this, and then she arranged group assignments between subjects. So she sort of constructed clusters, if you think about the image before, between subjects where they were supposed to analyze their own courses that they were responsible for, and critically, as critical friends, look into each other's courses, use student evaluations, and suggest improvements in relation to their sort of vision about the best physiotherapy program. Within these groups, they were also supposed to pick 1 or 2 critical friends outside that group that could sort of look into their process, look into their analysis. And all this was supposed to be reported in writing to the program leader. She then formed new groups, which was now within the subject. So you might teach within the same subject on year 1, year 2, and year 3, but you'd been part of different groups before. So they now had to design how would these different subjects fit with each other within the program. And now the program leader actually designated critical friends to each group. And her example here is that, well, we have these more psychological subjects within the physiotherapy program. And those psychologically profiled physiotherapists always are a bit sort of fuzzy in the edges, so they're not really structured. So they need a critical friend who's really structured. And so she sort of paired them up from her knowledge of the people and the subject areas. And they now had to suggest new improvements, which was presented at another day off campus in the same nice surroundings, nice meals, having collegial discussions based on this. And this has resulted in a totally new program which has now been recognized in Sweden by our quality accreditation agency as the best physiotherapy program in Sweden. And this is a work that has been going on for 4 or 5 years. So it's not a quick fix. It's patiently and deliberately designing a process where you can achieve these kinds of results.
So this raises issues about the timeline. How long does change take in this kind of environment? So, because something that has to be reminded of, and you touched upon it, is that this leader doing this had been a leader in this place for quite some years before this happened. So she was an acknowledged leader. Everybody accepted her as a leader. It would be different if anyone would be appointed new leader and just coming into the group and try to do this. That would work out differently. So there is always a tradition going on in these places, and that has to be accounted for. There has to be thought about that. The other thing is, what is really change in higher education? How do we know change happens? If you look into sort of every little thing that happens here, it might be invisible on the dean's level, for instance. That's why your deans couldn't answer the question, because the change is taking place in such a small steps, a continuous movement in small steps that just changes things and becomes invisible in the organization, even though it actually takes place. So that takes us into a question about how do we recognize change in this environment, and how do we indicate that things are actually going on? Usually, I would say, it's not big things. It's not going from here to there, doing a big innovation by buying up something, or introduce something totally new. Usually, change takes place in these small steps. So we have to be better at in our institutions to recognize and sort of report and find and detect that kind of slow pace improvement that goes on, because that is what we find usually is actually happening. Yep.
So we're just going to sum up some of the outcomes that we can see in our own institution.
I would like you to think back again at the clusters, the yellow faces, the green arrows and stuff. So what we do in our university, as you said, it's 6,000 staff, and you get a fair idea of the size of the university. We have 350 practice-based scholarly reports written by teachers about teaching every year. We collect them now, we're in the process of collecting them into databases which are searchable for colleagues, so they can find some. And I've already been part of that when 2 colleagues, they are seniors, they are going to do something about laboratory work in physics, and they did a search in this database and just found out that their own doctoral students had done something already, which they weren't aware of. So of course they went to them and, what did you do? And to me they have a conversation about, they already did this. So we thought about how could we add to this? And since they are clever people, they immediately identified, if this has been done already, we think this is now the most important thing to do. And that's when things start to build on top of each other, which is some very important thing to get going here. So we have all these reports. We know in those reports from research that student learning and educational theories is increasingly used by teachers when they try to understand what's going on. It's not a specific learning theory. We haven't put forward, this is the theory, because it's no such thing in educational theory. What we tell these teachers is that you should have the theory that helps you to see whatever you want to see, to understand whatever you want to understand. Because as you know, theories are terribly powerful when it comes to understand the observations you are doing or directing your attention to certain things. So they find all sorts of theories. I actually read one, which is a bit odd, where they use the theory of dog training. You might question the capacity of this theory in the end, and when you might have to abandon that for another theory, but this person was very experienced in dog training and find that appropriate to understand a phenomenon in teaching. Well, you can have all sorts of ideas about theories of dog training, but she was a good dog trainer and a good teacher. Good teaching, yeah, measured. We use the CEQ in some of our faculties. We had that for 10 years. The CEQ is the Course Experience Questionnaire. I think you had it in UK as called a module, blah, blah, something, and now you have your student SS, whatever, I can't, what is called? The student survey, the National Student Survey, yeah. I don't know the content of this. This is a research-based questionnaire based on the research on deep and surface approach to learning, and it's Ramsden. You know Ramsden in this country, don't you? No, he was in, sorry. Anyway, so we can see that it is brewing. And we can see that the scholarship of teaching and learning projects that we are talking about here is something that has eaten its way into the culture. It's now part of the promotion processes. It's part of the recruitment processes. It's part of the reward systems we have. In all these places, people are talking about, I did this at this presentation and here is the paper. I built upon these and these things, here are my references. What do you think? So we are slowly moving to the situation where I talked about earlier, that before you do anything in teaching and learning, look what your colleagues have already done and build on that instead of inventing the same thing again. So we know that we are moving in that direction, even though these things are so complex, so we're not really sure to what degree or what is actually going on.
I think maybe we should also stress the fact that we're considering this strategy as a local way of developing the teacher's capacity and the organization's capacity to support student learning. Because all our staff are really excellent researchers in their own fields, and we're not requiring from them to become educational researchers as well. So what they're doing is more for their own benefit and for the benefit of the local teaching culture that they are a part of, whether that is within a program or department or the school, but not necessarily sort of aiming for publishing things in international journals on education and teaching and learning. And that's a very conscious strategy on our behalf. Yeah, so we'll just let you have a look at what it looks like.
Yeah, here they are.
Yeah, here they are, working hard, sharing ideas in one of the settings.
This is actually in engineering, so what we do is to pair them up according to discipline. So physicists are working with physicists and chemists with chemists, and that's because we like the idea of learning thresholds and that kind of analysis of teaching and learning. There are certain specific problems in physics that you have to deal with when you have people to go in there. But they're all in the same room as the other ones, and the conferences are just like this one because they also have to talk to people from theology or something. And I have a good anecdote was some people in engineering and computer science were doing peer review of computing programs. So students were assessing each other's programs. And they've been doing that for quite a while. And they went to a conference like this, and suddenly there was a guy from Chinese, teaching Chinese, where he tried to do peer review and peer assessment by students. His problem was that he started off a sentence in Chinese, so do they write so? I'm not sure. So he started off a sentence in Chinese, and the students should sort of end that sentence. And the number of variations in how you can end a sentence is quite long, isn't it? You can do it in many, many ways, and that was his problem. So he now started to talk to these people in computer science. How do you deal with that? And they told him that in computer science there is a small number of variations in each of these computer programs, otherwise they wouldn't work. And they have a long discussion about how that works, and suddenly this is a place where two yellow faces actually meet and start to discuss things for real. not having it as an anecdote by someone else, starting to engage in this kind of phenomenon in teaching. So that was a good anecdote. Yeah.
And that's all.
Not really.
Time's
we have
up.
10 more minutes.
Yeah.
We have more minutes, and that was actually planned. So what we would like you to do now is something that some of you do with your students all the time. We want you to actually, for 2 minutes, pair up in 3. Can you say that? Pair up in 3.
3 up in pairs.
Yeah, I hope you understand what I mean. Find small groups, and in each and every one group, formulate one idea that you got out from this. Not necessarily what we said. It's more about what happened in your mind while we were talking. And we take the positive ones. We are not really in for critical questions. You can have that too. You can have that too. So anything that emerges in these small groups, and we will take 3 of them and listen to that. You see the instruction? Pair up in small groups, all right? Discuss one thing, come up with that, and we'll take 3 of them in the plenary session, and then we're done. 2 minutes, go ahead. So I would like to have 3, you know, now you have 3, and who would want to be first to report into what was the idea that struck you or the question you have? Here we are one. Usually it's a slightly gender bias in this, so thank you very much for joining in. So, please.
We had the...
Or you can stand up and speak loud. You're a teacher.
We just had the view in our group that one of the things that struck us was something that you said yourself, was about deans and senior managers, if you want. When it comes to where's the high quality teaching, don't know, but I'll tell you where the problems are. Yeah. But I think if you ask the same people about research, they'll be able to tell you where the high quality research is. And we just thought that was an interesting kind of contrast.
Yeah, yeah.
So one way of developing teaching and learning in an organization then is to find ways which are productive to reveal where high quality actually is. Yeah. And that's not easy, because in research we've been doing that for many hundreds of years now, so we know how to do that. In teaching we have just started to find that kind of ways of revealing that, but it is important, it's very important. Yep.
Sorry, I think just in essence it was very clear, very swift fika.
A Swedish gift for you.
Well, thank you very much. I think we use it already informally, but it's actually a very powerful tool. We're thinking a fika that's not just within our school or our section, but sort of what we're doing today, that maybe on a regular basis, just for a cuppa and a chat.
Actually, the physiotherapy program that I told you about, the leader there actually encouraged people to a larger extent than before to come and have the fika, because they had a joint fika room within the department, and within the big department people wanted them to fika with everybody else, but she actually decided, no, we're going to have fika on our own, the 30 of us, because we need those interconnections and those conversations over fika on the day-to-day basis to give even more energy into this developmental process. So fika can be very crucial. She mentioned it over and over again when we interviewed her.
If you've ever been to Sweden, you probably know this phenomenon. If you go there, you will know the phenomenon that you have fika. That's what you do. One more, there is a hand over there.
And the idea we had is that if everybody in this room was to write down one paragraph of one teaching challenge that they had and how they resolved it, what amazing resource it would be.
Yeah.
Oh.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Just get going.
I'll tell you about these accounts about teaching. They are culturally bound. So in engineering, there is now a norm that you should write 1,300 words, and they do. They do it in 2 columns,
Bullet points.
times 10 points, and they have graphs and tables, because that's what you do in engineering, all right? While in humanities you're working with, they need 4,000 words, and they have 1.5 space in between, and because that's how they do things. Yeah. You see, it's very important here to actually tap into the cultural norms that are already in place, because you cannot change them. That's how engineers do it. We can do one more. I said this on gender thing, and now we have, thank you.
I think it actually feeds on what was just said, but I think the idea that of looking to the research cultures that are so successful in sharing their ideas and how they're successful, and taking some of those points on. And one of the things that we have within our research group that we do really well is things called a data blitz. And it's a presentations time where people have one slide and they say their most important thing. And that really is sort of building on the idea of, doing a paragraph about what was your important research challenge over the past year, what was your important teaching challenge, and how did you solve it, to build up those networks of how you really speak to people.
One of the things that has happened in our institution is that when teachers take on what we call pedagogical courses, and you would call, Kathy, PG, certs, caps, they then go back to their department or their program, and they give a very brief lunch seminar on the project that they're working on within the program, so that their local colleagues not taking part of the program can get an idea. This is a really interesting article, and that inspired me to develop my assessment strategies in this way. What do you think of that? So that's a very sort of a common thing that we now see around our university.
Then I would like to tell an anecdote, one that it really reveals your genius, I must say, because Katarina works in humanities to a great deal, and they have departments, and in every department there is one study director, and the study director is sort of managing the courses, so you have one person teaching each one of them. In big departments you have a small number of study directors to do that, and they all meet up in a network. So what Katarina told them was that I can send you the names of any person taking part in this right now, being part of a pedagogical course right now, so that in a lunchtime break or anything, you can just talk to that person and say, you're in that course now, what are you doing, and what's happening, is that a good thing to do? Because these people will then actually have a conversation, there will be information flow, and these people taking these courses will be recognized as a person that is potentially a resource for the department. And that turned out to be excellent, actually. And it turned out to be that the study directors are now more interested in what's going on in these courses and how they can make them available for others. So I really find that to be one of your... It's not it's one of them.
Brilliant.
There are many.
So but it's building on the same strategy. Again, the green arrows, as many green arrows as possible. Yeah.
So thank you very much. This is up now. So thank you for listening.